Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the second of a monthly series called Ethics During COVID-19, where we explore issues that have come about because of the global pandemic and some of the difficult ethical questions that we are facing. So we're lucky today to be joined by Dr. Christopher DiCarlo. I'll ask Dr. DiCarlo to join us and turn his camera on. Dr. DiCarlo is a philosopher. He's an educator and author. He often teaches at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Toronto in Scarborough and at the Life Institute at Ryerson University in Toronto. Dr. DiCarlo is principal and founder of Critical Thinking Solutions, a consulting business for individuals, corporations, and not-for-profits in both the public and the private sectors. He is also the developer of the first pilot project in Canada to introduce universal critical thinking skills into Ontario Public High School curriculum, which started in the Upper Grand District School Board. But most importantly, Dr. DiCarlo is the ethics chair for the Canadian Mental Health Association of Waterloo Wellington. So welcome, Dr. DiCarlo. Before we formally get started though, I'll just let our viewers know that you may be joining us on either Zoom webinar link or on our Facebook Live broadcast. We are ready to receive questions from you on either platform, so feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section on either Zoom or Facebook, and we will do our best to answer all your questions. If we can't get to your questions live, we will endeavor to answer your questions at our next webinar. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted on the Canadian Mental Health Association Waterloo Wellington webpage and our YouTube channels when the webinar is over. So without further ado, Dr. DiCarlo, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Allison. I'll share my screen. I've got a ton of material, so I'm gonna get going. All right. So a brief history of vaccines and vaccine hesitancy. Basically, when the British physician Edward Jenner introduced his vaccine for smallpox in 1796, he was a bit of a hero and also a quack. That's how people viewed him. Smallpox had plagued the world for centuries, causing all kinds of disfiguring pustules and blindness and about death in 30% of the cases. He used the technique, variolation. So you kind of deliberately infect people with kind of a lesser form of the disease. This had been used in other parts of the world, but very complicated at that time and very risky. He discovered that dairymaids became immune to smallpox after catching cowpox, kind of a less dangerous relation of that form. And so he tested this, of course, on an 8-year-old son of his gardener with pus drawn from cowpox blisters. Jenner later injected the boy with some of the smallpox virus. The boy did not become ill, so therefore smallpox had its first vaccine. Not the best clinical trial in the world, probably violated a few research ethics boards violations, but nonetheless, here we are. And so almost immediately people became suspicious and skeptical of this. Obviously the clergy, they were against it. It was unchristian, and they warned against the claims, that the body should not be contaminated with animal matter. And so you had, rumors circulating stating that it would cause children and adults to develop cow-like attributes. You can see in this marvelous depiction of Jenner here giving, various people the jab, and you can see bovine sources, people turning into cows and cows coming out of people's orifices in various ways and so on and so forth. It's just, you can imagine that the type of fear it would have generated. So obviously, people were against this notion, but nonetheless, in 1840, the British government introduced the British Vaccination Act, which made it compulsory for children on penalty of fines or jail time for parents. Critics immediately derided the latter law as dangerous, as an assault on human autonomy, as an assault on their bodies. and they organized themselves into anti-vaccination leagues, which held mass rallies and protests. They carried banners, children's coffins, and effigies of Jenner. This sounds at all familiar with what we see today with anti-lockdown and anti-mask rallies. It has had its precedents for sure. The law was abolished later in 1898, and there was a clause put in for conscientious objectors to allow people to opt out of having the vaccine. That's the first time we see the term conscientious objectors. In 1879, William Tebb, who was, heading up the Vaccination Inquirer, a British journal devoted to anti-vaccine propaganda, he came to America and they established the Anti-Vaccination Society of America. This society was established, obviously, because they were opposed to laws requiring smallpox vaccinations. The same movement proceeded to speak out against other types of vaccinations later, of course, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, as well as the classic measles, mumps, and rubella. Now, such a movement, believe it or not, found its way into Canada. So in 1895, there was a smallpox outbreak in Montreal, and English and French Canadians were sort of pitted against each other and divided in regards to this kind of newly developed vaccine. In Michael Bliss's book, Plague, A Story of Smallpox in Montreal, we find there's a kind of an ethnic and education biases played out very heavily, and in determining what side people came down on, and in which way the debate would go in terms of this new science, sounding again prescient and familiar with what we're seeing in the States, with Republicans viewing the mask and now vaccines as a type of banner, political banner, as to where you stand. So it's quite interesting to see that parallel. Roughly along Montreal's linguistic fault line, this is a quote, between the city's 5 French and 4 English newspapers, which echoes the split that was so evidently early in the COVID-19 pandemic in the US between mainstream media and Fox News. The French press, unconvinced that smallpox was serious, poured scorn on sensation-seeking English papers, Bliss writes. We know all too well how that sounds today. So it's an interesting parallel that we're seeing between what has been happening and what is happening, and hopefully what won't be happening again in the future. We can hope. At the time, Dr. Alexander Ross, the author of a pamphlet that circulated widely in Montreal in 1885 during an outbreak, talked no longer of Russian tyranny. That's nothing, it's the vaccinations that he assured, did not prevent smallpox. It caused other things. You're going to get syphilis. It might even give you smallpox, and it'll kill your children outright. So a lot of fear mongering was happening at the time. What's more, he claimed, the best way to protect yourself is pure air, cleanliness, and of course, temperance. For proof, so-called proof, he offered the testimonies of a number of individuals whose names, of course, were prefixed by professor or doctor or sir. There's always a few of those around. It's important to note, over time and through education, and most importantly, effectiveness, smallpox, we know, has been eradicated throughout the world. The movement in India alone, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the history of smallpox eradication, but thanks to the World Health Organization and several devoted leaders, Nicole Grassett, Mary Guinan, and Cornelia Davis, they headed up troops that literally went door to door in villages and towns in India to make sure people were vaccinated. That's the big push that came in the early 1960s, and it was absolutely an incredible feat. Now, by 1955, Jonas Salk had developed a polio vaccine, which wiped out recurring polio epidemics by the early 1960s. However, by 2019, Pakistan was experiencing a polio outbreak due in large part to rumors that children who were becoming sick after receiving the vaccine, and causing many parents to say, no, I'm not going to allow that. So it's largely due to things like ignorance and fear that fairly recently people have been influenced to believe today, or fairly recently within the last 20 years, they're worried about chemicals in vaccines. Thimerosal, people believe, caused autism back in 2007, right? Based on the false article published in the Lancet by Mr. Andrew Wakefield, not Dr. Andrew Wakefield. That has been stripped, and rightly so, from him. And of course, Jenny McCarthy picked up on this, and many of you will be familiar with the idea that she had about her own child exhibiting symptoms of autism shortly after getting the vaccine. Therefore, the vaccine had to have caused this. In critical thinking, the official title of this in Latin is a post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, simply because something occurred after something, therefore that prior thing had to have been the cause. We commit this fallacy all the time, and if we're concerned parents, we commit it more often than we would like. So she was all about greening our vaccines, getting these toxic preservatives out of them. Of course, they don't exist. The vaccines have go through, as we'll see, rigorous testing to assure that they are in fact safe. Now, what I found is that we might want to talk about things like the spectrum of vaccine hesitancy. At its lowest level might involve people who might doubt the efficacy or value of vaccinations, but want just more information about them. And then at the farthest end, of course, are anti-vaxxers. Just because you're are hesitant about vaccines doesn't necessarily make you an anti-vaxxer. So there is a spectrum. There are those who know that it's good, but maybe they have allergies, or maybe a woman's pregnant, right? There's all kinds of reasons other than just being anti-vaxxer. So we can't just jump from the mildly hesitant to the anti-vaxxer. And so when we're thinking critically and ethically, we're going to utilize these tools of critical thinking, right? We're going to look at how arguments are structured and what people's biases are in the context, and evidence and fallacies and all those good things, right? In terms of ethics, right, we have to consider, value. What is the value behind judging this type of inaction? Do we ridicule these people? Do we try to embarrass them into getting the vaccine? How do we value when a person is hesitant? How do we deal with that? What strategies do we take if it's somebody in our family that we care very much about, and all they do is get their information on Facebook and Twitter, right? Is it one's duty, to get vaccinated as soon as possible? A duty to oneself, one's community, one's country, and the world writ large, right? The more of us that get vaccinated, the quicker we reach herd immunity, the faster we get back to so-called normality. And of course, there are ethical theories that we ground our ideas into. So first, let's do a little bit of fact finding. What are they? How do they work? For those who don't know, they're made of small amounts of genetic material from weak or dead viruses. And when these are put into our body, they trigger our immune system to seek out and disable or destroy any and all viruses that look similar to those. Basically, our B cells and our T cells are activated to either make the virus inactive or dormant, or kill it outright. They cause our bodies to remember in future cases, should we become exposed to that virus, it has the capacity to identify it and then activate our immune system to go and attack it. So there are many good sources out there. It allows our bodies to act defensively. And I put a link in there so people afterwards can click on it if they want to learn more. basically, here's something I found online, which shows in a very kind of easy graphic, here's a weak or dead form of the germ. It's introduced that sparks our immune system to develop these antibodies. These antibodies then take care of the germs and in future act as a shield, as it were. So there's a lot of interesting analogies that are out there to educate the public. Lots of developments have occurred. Currently, there's 43 vaccines in clinical trials on humans throughout the world, in addition to the ones that have already been approved. I've put in a link if anyone wants to see how far along they are. How are they developed and how are they tested? Well, they have to go through a series of phases, rigorous phases. It's basically genetic vaccines have to deliver some of the coronavirus's own genetic material into our cells in order to prompt that response. This is what we see with Moderna and Pfizer. This is a brand new form of vaccine where just a small amount of information is introduced into our body, which triggers our immune system and activates these antibodies. The Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca use an old school viral vector vaccine. They'll take a weakened virus, a cold virus or whatnot that's been weakened and whatnot, and they'll put some of the genetic material of SARS-CoV-2 into that, inject it into our body. Our bodies respond as though we have been infected with the virus itself, and our antibodies get fired up, and so we become protected. In the future, we know that in China, they've developed a Sinovac biotech vaccine, which is a protein-based vaccine. These are the basic three types. This one is less efficacious than the first two, but nonetheless still shows promise nonetheless. There are three phases in the development of vaccines. First phase is basically we want to learn about dosages. How much can the human body take? How much is too much? How much is too less? And so on. Phase 3, are there any benefits and are there any side effects? So done with fairly small groups. And then of course in phase 3, that's where you see the large groups being involved, 20, 30, 40,000 people. And essentially there's a specific strategy in finding out who gets infected and who does not get infected. Believe it or not, there is actually a phase 4. And that's what we're experiencing now when you see AstraZeneca being pulled because of relationships of blood clots. So this is known as post-market studies. Here we have the vaccine adverse event reporting system, where there's a phone number anybody can call and determine whether or not there are side effects. Unfortunately, anti-vaxxers have bombarded this system with bogus information, which is unfortunate. It's not helping science in the least, and it's only developing more pseudoscientific and unwarranted claims of people who already are predisposed not to favor the value of vaccines. So that is unfortunate. During these phases, we want to know, do they work? And in phase 3, we have to split groups of people into 2 groups. You have a controlled clinical trial. In the one group, they get the vaccine. In the other group, they get a placebo. They don't get the vaccine. Those people then go on their way out into the public, and over time, they record how many of the people in the study group who received the vaccine became infected versus those in the placebo group. And when you hear about like Pfizer and Moderna, 95%, huge numbers and whatnot, these are off the scale. The flu shot, the seasonal flu shot we get every year is 50 to 60% max. And which means it's going to save us. It means that if we get influenza A, influenza B, whatever strain is moving around throughout the world at that time, it means we're probably not going to be hospitalized and we're probably not going to die. Like that's really what we're talking about here, is making sure that the those afflicted worse with this are saved, and that could be any one of us, and we don't know who that is. Why does a 117-year-old French nun survive COVID-19, and a 19-year-old superstar basketball player in Lincoln, Nebraska, this kid dies? From how, what is the pathology behind that? It doesn't seem to make much sense to us, but nonetheless, there's a lot to figure out with how viruses attack our immune systems and, harm our bodies in various ways. So that's why we have this controlled clinical trial. And we ask ourselves, is the treatment going to prevent or remedy a particular disease? Well, does it do more good than harm with patients? And will it be as good or better than available alternative treatments? And this is the standard for all drug treatments and how all drugs are go through these phases. So what we have to do is understand that people will be sacrificed. That's an ethical consideration, isn't it? You're going to be in that placebo group. You're not going to receive the vaccine, and you're going to go out into the public, and you may get COVID, and you could potentially die, and you agree to be in that group, not knowing whether you're going to get the vaccine or not. So those people are kind of like heroes. We should realize that we're getting the vaccine now because people made that sacrifice, and good on them for volunteering so that others will live. Others will have the capacity to continue to have our lives. So we have to acknowledge those within the placebo group. And to me, all of the animals that have ever been used in trials, they need a huge shout out for their lives to have been sacrificed so that we may benefit from these medical breakthroughs. So the reason why we have these blinded control groups is so that we reduce our bias, so that we can remain objective and know that what we're seeing is the truth in science. We're able to see this. So the control group gets the placebo. These are called blinded. There's sometimes single blinded, where the recipients don't know which group they're in. And more often than not, they're double blinded, where the recipients don't know which group they're in. And those who are doing the testing don't know which group they're in. It's only the supervisors who know who's in which group. And then when the testing is done, do the comparative analysis between the placebo group and the group that received the vaccine. So they can be single blinded or double blinded. And these are used to limit our bias. Now, it's enforced ignorance. You're deliberately blinding so that you don't project what you want. We want the vaccines to work, but we have to blind ourselves in order to remain objective. Otherwise, we'd want to say, yeah, you look like you're feeling better. You don't really have the virus. We can't do that. We have to take that out. And as a result, it creates this very interesting ethical scenario in which one group is going to suffer and another group is going to be protected. So, right. So here's the interesting thing. You might be thinking, doesn't a vaccine need to be 100% effective? No, not necessarily. Dr. Francis Collins, head of NIH, said 50% is a long way from zero. So our seasonal flu shots that we get are 50+%. Most influenza vaccines come in at around that level, and they help a lot of people from contracting, or if they do contract it, it's not nearly as bad. Some people, because they're hesitant, might think, well, weren't these vaccines rushed? Very interesting. September 8th, 2020, 9 major drug companies signed a pledge. This was kind of, had never been done in history, stating that they're going to stand with science and not develop a vaccine prematurely unless and until it had gone through thorough and rigorous testing for public safety and effectiveness. So the companies did not rule out seeking an emergency authorization of the vaccines, from the FDA in the United States and Health Canada here. They promised any potential coronavirus vaccine would be decided based on large, high-quality clinical trials, and that the companies would follow guidance from regulatory agencies like the FDA. We believe this pledge will help ensure public confidence in the rigorous scientific and regulatory process by which COVID-19 vaccines are evaluated and may ultimately be approved. So here we have Francis Collins, and he stated that the Data and Safety Monitoring Board, the DSMB, watches. They're the watchdogs. They're the gatekeepers. They look at these vaccine trials, and I love it. Collins said, "We're scientists, not politicians." And so they literally watch over the testing of these vaccines, and look at the placebos, look at the test groups and the control groups, and then look at the data. And if the data is accurate and confirmed, then fine. And if it's not, then it gets chucked out. Many of you will not have heard of the failed attempts. There was an Aussie group, Australian group, doing protein-based work that looked very promising in the beginning. It crashed and burned. It failed. It did not work. You don't hear about that stuff. And there's a really good documentary recently, this past weekend on CNN, which covered the agony that this leading professor went through, because you want it to work. You want to help people. But I'm glad they showed this in the documentary. Failed attempts are valuable in science. We've lost our way a bit in the scientific community. Failed attempts are good, because even though a lot of money goes into them, a lot of time expenditure and all that, we know that's a road we don't want to go down again in the future, or we learn things that we can apply to future cases. But so much emphasis has been placed on success in science that we've shied away from all of those who went down avenues that turned out to be unsuccessful. But those are helpful as well. And in science, that's a good thing. It's good to know what doesn't work in comparison to what is working. So again, these people are heroes. They're amazing. They've taken, they've hardly slept since the beginning of March of 2020. And they've done this painstaking, very, very difficult work. So, kudos to all of the people, successes and failures, because that's how science gets done. And that's how that's how lives are saved. That's how we live, because of their efforts in making this happen. So here's Collins, and really, really interesting guy. He's basically saying that, look, there's a lot of agencies in place. They're not rushed. They're like gatekeepers. They assure nothing gets approval without strong scientific evidence. You've got to stay the course with science. You can't let ideology trump science. This isn't some weird postmodernist, universe where everything's just a narrative. No, science works. And that's why we live, because science works. And the rigorous process through which science works is what keeps us alive. So we need to honor the fact that these people, have been able to do this, but the FDA, the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, they don't let anything pass unless it's gone through rigorous standardized procedures. He also mentioned that CEOs of large pharmaceutical companies, they're not going to start cranking out stuff to find out later that it's not efficacious, that it doesn't work, not simply to cover their butts because of lawsuits and class action suits and whatnot. No, but also for the benefit of humanity, that they need to be able to do that. So there are a lot of protective steps in place to assure that once a vaccine is ready, it's both safe and effective. So we can look at arguments and biases in all context and evidence of those who might be vaccine hesitant. So the first thing we have to understand about vaccine hesitancy is that it's an argument, right? People are putting forward an argument, and that means It's a main point and reasons in support of that main point. So those who are vaccine hesitant and those who are not have in their mind argument. Sorry, I'm lagging a bit. Okay, good. So an argument is made up of a point, what we call the conclusion, and reasons that support that, or the premises. In thinking of arguments, consider a house, right? Whatever you believe is your roof. Whatever supports your belief, we call premises, or the walls. And then these walls rest on universal criteria. We want our premises or our reasons to be consistent and not overly complicated, reliable, relevant, and sufficient. This is how argumentation works. And if your premises fail to satisfy this universal criteria, we can't really support that roof and it comes crashing down. When people say they're vaccine hesitant, this is what their argument would look like. I'm hesitant to receive this vaccine because of A or B or C, right? We have these types of positions. Right? Now, a lot of people are not trusting the evidence that's presented in front of them. So it breaks vaccine hesitant people generally into two categories: those who are more inclined to be conspiratorial and those who are not. Do you know anyone who is vaccine hesitant? 100%. Wow, that's pretty high. That's really high. Wow. Very good. Right. So there are levels of ignorance involved in all levels of science, right? We might be just lacking in information, and better to be safe than sorry. I don't know enough about the science. I don't know what that stuff is. I'm not going to let them shoot it into me, right? So there are levels of ignorance, degrees of ignorance we're dealing with. And of course, there's fear, trypanophobia. In all of this talk of vaccine hesitancy, I've never seen anyone just look up who's phobic of needles. Look at this. Bugs, snakes, other animals, claustrophobia, strangers, clowns, ghosts. Look at blood and needles. That's pretty high up in terms of, so are people vaccine hesitant because they don't like getting shots? Like, could it just be that simple? You know, are we overthinking this? There are some people who are so hesitant of just getting needles, they'll pass out when it really has a strong effect on some people. So maybe we should be wondering to what extent people just fear getting shots, period. It's not don't vaccinated. It's just like, I hate getting needles, right? There are levels of misinformation, right? Whenever I've gotten a seasonal flu shot, I always get the flu. I'm sure you've heard somebody say this. No, I'm not getting that, right? Or people hear that it causes autism or whatever, right? There might be economic factors. I know people who were hesitant because friends of theirs had some side effects and really didn't feel like going into work. They're not getting paid, right? So it might just be purely economic. I'm not taking the risk of having to take a day off or whatnot because I can't afford that. The media is largely responsible. Fox News, Tucker Carlson, what a wonderful human being. Tucker Carlson staring into the camera, looking like a puppy, looking into a fan, spreading disinformation, and must know that he's doing this. But enough of Tucker. Ethnicity can be factors. Some of you might remember what happened in Alabama in the early part of the 20th century, all the way up into the 1970s, with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where Southern Black males who had syphilis were supposed to be getting treatments. They weren't. They were just being watched, and some of them suffered and died because of that. So there might be lingering effects of experimentation that had been done within ethnicities. In Pakistan, we're seeing this, especially with polio vaccines. You might not realize this, but one of the ways in which the US troops found Osama bin Laden was they put up a fake vaccine registration booth, and were able to, that helped locate him. And so that's going to have lingering effects as well. Some Muslims believe that the jab is simply a kind of a type of a plot. It has nothing to do with polio whatsoever. Then there are those who believe that, my body, my choice, period. Don't give me this kind of mandatory compulsory stuff. I'm all about personal liberty, right? Some people have medical concerns, right? Pregnancies, immunocompromised, allergies, right? Isn't it better to build my immunity by getting sick? When the chickenpox vaccine became available when our kids were young, a colleague of mine who teaches biology in high school said, "What are you doing? Why are you spending $200 to get a vaccine for your kids when it's the most natural thing? We've all had chickenpox." Yep. And some kids have died from chickenpox as well. If I don't have to take that chance, why on earth would I? So basically, here's the deal. If you don't get the, say the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, you got about a 1 in 500 chance of dying. The side effects, maybe 1 in a million. So it's a numbers game. And I don't think people fully understand the probabilities that are involved with vaccinations and the likelihood of harmful effects. People are freaking out, 1 in 60,000 chance of getting blood clots from AstraZeneca, which would be horrible. But have you never watched American television and seen a commercial come on for any drug whatsoever, and the last half of the commercial is, "Do not take this drug if you've been experiencing this," and it's just an entire list of disclaimers of that you are far more likely to have side effects leading to death with cross use of medications over the counter than you ever will from vaccines. But we don't focus on those odds. It's like flying in a plane. It's like flying in a plane versus driving, right? The odds are much higher at driving of accidents than flying in planes. Do vaccines really work? People, wonder. No, they're not 100% effective. Why am I hearing 70% in this and that? They might get confused as to how, in fact, they do work. What about those who are exempt from getting vaccinations, right? Today, they fall into 3 main categories, right? You may be medically exempt for a specific reason. There are philosophical exemptions, and of course, there are religious exemptions. The philosophical are also called personal belief exemptions. I'm not 100% clear on what that actually means and how far that actually extends. I wasn't able to find much information about that. That does not mean anybody at any time can just say, "No, for personal reasons, for philosophical reasons, I'm just not going to get this," right? Medical, we can understand. Religion, that's an interesting one. There are just a few religions that have absolute objection to vaccines. Church of the Firstborn, End Time Ministries, Faith Assembly, Faith Tabernacle, and First Century Gospel Church are some. First Church of Christ. Scientists, because they believe in healing through prayer and that vaccines aren't really necessary. Some Amish, some Dutch Reform, and some Jewish and Muslim fundamentalists. And that's some. Right, so how should we be thinking critically and about information regarding these vaccines, right? Well, clearly, we want to start with information that's been attained in a responsible and reliable manner, and that's evidence-based, and there are plenty of places in which we can find this information. Facebook and Twitter, not the best sources. So we need to be media literate and media savvy in how we receive our information. But we can find better and worse information online if we know where and how to look for it. What about ethics and vaccine hesitancy? Well, here's our old friends again, right? Coming down between paternalism and autonomy. How much freedom or autonomy do we allow our citizens to say, no, the vaccine's not for me? And how paternalistic, like a parent, do we say, you're getting it, right? You're eating all your vegetables, right? How much like a parent to members of society should we be in saying, look, unless 70 to 80% of us are all vaccinated, we're never going to reach herd immunity. So you don't just have the luxury to say, no, I think I'll pass. We really need to get shots in arms. Or if it turns out that people really don't like getting needles, then we better engineer something real fast for inhalers, which I think Israel is working on, and some other countries are working on vaccine through an inhaler. So maybe that will go some distance into convincing people to get vaccinated. Deontology versus utilitarianism. How much is it our duty to go out and get vaccinated as a citizen so that we reach that? Like, if you want to talk about democracy, this is it, which is absolutely amazing in the States, seeing so many Republicans saying, not getting it. Nope, it's under Biden. So screw those people. They're Democrats. I'm not getting it just to spite them. Well, you're cutting your nose off to spite your face, essentially. Not only are you not going to be safe and those around you not going to be safe, but if we don't reach herd immunity and mutations continue to develop, it may over time turn into something much more nasty than what we're dealing with now. Utilitarianism is at the heart of democracy, the greatest good for the greatest number. What's good for you is good for the many, and what's good for the many is good for you. So it seems to be a pretty much a classic case of, do we have a duty to get vaccinated, and is it going to be the greatest good for the greatest number? Right? We have all kinds of ethical dilemmas. What about conscientious objectors? They have autonomy, but at what cost to public health? Is their autonomy more valuable than the greater good for the greater number? So now then we can ask ourselves, right? In the fields that we find ourselves, how do we help, right? Well, there seems to be, in many cases, an information deficit model. If we can get more information, this will help combat the problem. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You can sometimes present all the information in the world to somebody. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It just might not matter. More information might just be ineffective, right? But what about seeing is believing? Smallpox vaccinations were really successful because people started to look around and realized others weren't getting sick. So it worked. It worked a lot, right? And of course, there's this diametric process at work that I talk about in my latest book that I'm completing on conspiracy theories, and that is, as valuable journalism started to tail off over the last 20 years, newspapers started to dry up, and social media started to rise. There was a lot more availability of misinformation and disinformation online, and so we need to protect ourselves against that kind of false information. And so I'm very impressed with this group headed up by Heidi Larson, the Vaccine Confidence Project. They explore like rumor and dignity and distrust and risk and emotional contagion, choice, and all this kind of thing. She's very impressive. She argues that no vaccine or medical product is totally risk-free. There will always be grounds for rumors. No matter. Sorry, I'm lagging a bit. She wants to delete false information or misinformation that's out there, and these are a lot of the reasons for this underlying distrust that she's finding. And so she helps doctors and health care professionals and public health agencies and governments. You got to listen to and involve and engage these individuals to try to make a better case for vaccinations. Here in Canada, the Canadian Pediatric Society, they're working with vaccine hesitant patients and have been all kinds of vaccine hesitant, from MMR up to COVID-19. They don't want to dismiss these refusers, but identify their concerns, to use clear language, present what the risks and the benefits are fairly and accurately, reinforce parental responsibility, and don't forget to explain how to manage pain upon immunization, side effects, those types of things. So there's a lot of things we can do. We establish honest and respectful dialogue with those who are vaccine hesitant, acknowledge those risks, but balance them against the risk of getting the disease, which is much worse. Refer parents to reputable sources of vaccine information. Keep these conversations ongoing with vaccine hesitant families. Completely share this information and use a conversational tone as opposed to a lecturing one. This seems to have produces better results. We can debunk specific myths, right? But we don't have to spend excessive amount of time doing this because it often just further entrenches the fear within the individual. Let's focus on facts and just call them straight up. They're myths and they're false. Moving on. We don't have to keep going over and over it. Let's keep information simple, as simple as possible, right? If the myth seems simpler than the truth, it may be easier for people to accept that simple myth. Like people like, kind of quick and short captions. People find that storytelling and the use of anecdote are often very helpful. You can, if somebody says, I heard that, you can say, oh, no, that's not what I heard. In fact, I know that my patients or my clients or my friends and colleagues, they all have taken it and they've had none of this whatsoever. And now they're going out and they can meet in their backyards, they can keep distance until, once they get their second shot, then they're fully vaccinated, they should be able to meet. And, there's a lot more freedom and autonomy to their doing that. Sometimes a more paternalistic or presumptive approach from doctors, your son needs 3 shots today, is more likely to result in patient acceptance of vaccines during a clinic visit than a participatory approach. Well, what do you guys want to do about the shots? So if it's what we know is for the benefit of the individual, then this is actually using that kind of paternalistic over the autonomous approach and saying, okay, straight up, doctors are now using this approach. Your son needs 3 shots today. Have you had the COVID vaccine shot yet? Have you had your first one? Which shot did you get? Right. So they say maybe you should phrase it in that kind of a way. We're talking about a normative choice here, aren't we? We're talking about that there are better and worse ways of doing things. And so we nearly half of initially vaccine resistant parents accepted vaccinations if physicians persisted in their initial recommendation. So these are interesting stats for us to realize. So other forms of incentivizing, there's something called nudging. My son Jeremy is just finishing up his master's in behavioral economics, where nudging is very popular. Nudging is a way in which we can influence people to do things that are for the benefit of themselves and or others. And so they call it nudging. One of the most classic examples are the urinals in Amsterdam's Schiphol airport. You see a fly in the urinal that's painted. And so men naturally aim towards it and it prevents splashback, and it saves in money and mess and spread of disease and that sort of thing. So it was a very clever nudge technique that was used to affect the outcome of human behavior. This raises ethical questions. Is it ethical to nudge someone without their consent into doing something they maybe didn't want to do, even if it's for their own benefit, even if it saves their lives, right? My parents' generation used to say things like, some people are just too stupid for their own good. You just have to, do what we need to do, right? And we can remember the seatbelt laws. Some of you will remember when this became a law, there was a lot of outcry. No, we shouldn't do this. We don't need to do this. So there's positive and negative incentivizing. Negative, well, if you don't get the shot, you can't fly, you can't attend events, or concerts or that type of thing. Families can become divided, right? You might have a member of your family say, I'm not getting that. Well, why not, right? Well, we've all gotten it. Why aren't you, right? Positive, right? Money talks. The Ohio governor, right? Mike DeWine, he's basically put together 5 weekly draws for $1 million. If you've been vaccinated, you're in the draw. And you could win $1 million. Well, I'm going to go and get vaccinated. Like, this is very clever, right? People like lotteries, it speaks to them on a certain level, right? They get, only those who are vaccinated are eligible. So it's very clever. West Virginia, kids, come on in. You get $100 in US bonds. New Orleans, shot for shot. Literally, you get your shot, you get a coupon, you go to the bar. There you go, right? This was really interesting on CNN, UCLA poll. Would you be more willing to get a vaccine if you receive these amounts of money? And look at the figures that go up as the dollar amounts go up. Geez, you throw a couple of $100, $300, $500, your problem solved, right? So really interesting. So we understand human biases when it comes to engaging in dialogue with those who are vaccine hesitant. In other words, let's try to understand why. What has biased them to be hesitant in the first place, right? And so we can come up with successful interventions to connect emotionally with these relationships and try to garner trust, right? Humor is sometimes good. A lot of talk shows, Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel and others are using this. We need to use stories over stats. People really don't care sometimes if you just show, figure after figure after figure. They get tired of that. But a story of what a great time your family had, all being able to see each other again, these types of things can help people understand the importance of getting vaccinated. The epidemiologist, Stephen Leader, said facts are not rejected because they are seen as being wrong, but because they're sometimes they're irrelevant. People want to believe in whatever it is that makes them hesitant. So the bottom line is to conclude that we need to wield compassion and judgment. Information and compassion are powerful tools in correcting myths and starting conversations about vaccines. The most important roles you can have is to make sure vaccine hesitant people have the opportunity to be heard, right? Most people are trying to make their best decisions to protect themselves and their families. And coming from that understanding allows, the compassion and empathy to approach them openly instead of at a place where it puts them on the defensive. So our research suggests that the same approach used for talking with those who foster conspiratorial beliefs will have similar success with those who are vaccine hesitant. And that is essentially to listen, to develop a relationship of trust, to then start to suggest, and then just keep repeating. So listen, get a trusting relationship, start making suggestions, not too vigorously, then kind of back off, and then you continue this. And we found that this approach has had considerable success. So I think I can close off there. And Allison, I don't know if we have any questions, but.
I love those photos at the end. I think that sums up what we've seen for the last little bit. Yeah, we do have a couple of questions here. So I'll just ask, so first one is from Laura, who says, has the FDA approved the vaccines? I heard that they only did due to the state of emergency, but is this the same? And I think this is a question that we often get around vaccine hesitancy, which is the speed at which the vaccines were approved. So
I've had clients, by the way, it's called emergency use, EUA, emergency use authorization. And during pandemics, that can be done. So I've had a client that I'm counseling say, too fast, Dr. DeCarlo. I said, yeah, normally you would think that, except that this time around, the entire world was working on it. So it might seem like it was too fast. They normally take 2 to 5 to 10 years. But when you got an entire world focused on one thing, and all those minds are coming together, plus all of the information that virologists had about preceding coronaviruses, it's not like they started from nothing. They had some information. Then the genome of the virus was done within 2 weeks in March. That was a huge factor. And that became public. All labs around the world now had the genome of SARS-CoV-2. That really sped things up. And then the new mRNA, by the way, Alison Gould and Dr. Charpentier, 2 women who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for CRISPR-Cas9 genetic technology, really helped this whole thing along to allow for this mRNA technology to be sped up. When Pfizer and Moderna pulled this off, like, I don't know if you guys realize, this is huge technology in terms of how you're going to see cancer treated in the future. You're going to see it because cancer, right? We know a lot of it is due to viruses, right? We get viruses and then it mutates and so on. So this new technology is not just going to help us with COVID-19. You wait in the next 10 or 20 years, start watching cancer treatments using this type of CRISPR-Cas9 technology that is about to save the entire planet from this deadly pandemic. So there are so many connected stories with all of this. It seems rushed, it wasn't. And the phases they went through were by the books. And as Francis Collins kept emphasizing, we would never have let anything reach human arms that hadn't passed rigorous testing. So.
Right. And that's where that ethics framework does come in at the end of the day.
That's
Another
right.
question that we received from Facebook, and I think you talked a little bit about this when you talked about the way in which to approach hesitancy. One of the questions is, what about those family members that don't want to be around vaccinated people because they are extremists? So you had a couple of sort of guiding points there about how to talk to people who are hesitant.
Like, I want to make sure I'm getting the question right. They don't want to be around those who have been vaccinated?
Yeah, interestingly, I've seen that actually with a few contacts that I've had, people who, again, it's maybe a misinformation thing, that they're worried around being around people who have been vaccinated.
Well, for fear that something
The vaccine might.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, dealing with that level of ignorance is tricky, right? Because where do you start? I suppose there are sources online for sure that shows what happens to the mRNA when it goes into our bodies, and then it basically just triggers our immune system, and then it has no further effect. Some people believe that because it's mRNA, it's going to change our DNA in some way. Not unlike, if you think about it, people believing that we're going to get cow parts from the Jenner, right? From the, right? Like, that kind of makes consistent sense in their mind. So I guess to battle that would be to try to demonstrate in as simple a way as possible that it has no effect on our DNA whatsoever and cannot. And to basically show, I guess, like large numbers. Why do you think in Israel people were the first to be able to go without masks? Why do you think in the United States now are now saying, hey, we're going to have our July 4th, party in the backyard? And what do you think that's a coincidence? Do you think that's just, for no reason whatsoever? So we would have to tailor are ways, depending on the circumstance, to what measures might reach that individual, because each person is going to be biased differently, right? And then we have to think, what has led them to come to that conclusion, whereas we've come to this conclusion over here? And then if you can work within their biases and context in ways that will best be represented to them. So what I'm saying now in conspiracy theories is we take those people who were conspiracy theorists, like Kyrie Irving, who believed the world was flat and who no longer believes that. You put his face up there front and center and say, I once believed this, I was wrong. So you get somebody in that person's world, a thought leader, an artist, a musician, I don't care who, that they admire, and try to go see that person just got vaccinated. Like some of the Trumpists, this guy got his vaccine in private, and didn't come out big and bold saying, go and get it, right? He's always playing this slime ball, nasty, horrible kind of political movement where you can if you want, he's trying to do that freedom kind of thing. But yeah, try to get somebody that person identifies with.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the great talk that you did last month, which is also still available on the CMHA website, around conspiracy theories. So those of you who haven't watched that, please go and watch that. We have one more question. I'm hoping we can get it in. You alluded to really what is sort of the ethics around states incentivizing sometimes to get the vaccines. You talked about would you get it for $100? Apparently, the state of Ohio has said that they will enter everybody who's had a vaccine into a lottery.
Yeah.
For $1 million a week. And I just wondered about the ethics of that as it relates to, you talked earlier a little bit about some of the racialized communities that have a hesitancy, somewhat legitimately because of, bad history related to state, again, intervention in their own medical care. Is it ethical then for the state to create these incentives while, not maybe addressing the hesitancy of racialized populations?
I think they are. Governor DeWine looks like a pretty decent person. I'm sure he's aware of the whole kind of baggage of the Tuskegee experiments that were done. Basically, yeah, what we need again to do is, if he can get leaders within the community to demonstrate to various minority ethnic groups, it doesn't have to just be Blacks, it can be Hispanic, it can be Chinese, Vietnamese, it doesn't matter which groups might be hesitant. You got to go to the leaders of those communities and get those leaders to step up and say, look, this is what's going on. I got it. You should get it. There's nothing to fear, right? The lottery thing, I think that's kind of a great example. When I used to coach, it can go kind of awry in some cases. I'll give you an example. When I used to coach basketball, every now and again, my wife would just come down at halftime and say, guys, $1 a basket. I'll give you a loon for every basket you get. Well, that's a great incentive, for kids to, but they'll just start taking any shots then to try to get money. So much for my coaching ability and having them play according to a certain structure. Here, you're right. Are people belying their hesitancy only for the sake of the hope of winning $1 million? Is it like dangling the carrot, rather than using the stick approach? There are some epidemiologists I can hear right now saying, who cares? Does it work? Does it get shots in arms? Then use it. It's not that immoral. The state is only spending $5 million on this. That's coming from federal money. They're allowed to use them. They're allowed to use the money any way they see fit. And so Governor DeWine thinks that's the best way. Sure, why not?
Well, and we'll have to see how things go. I know that Canada, we're tracking quite well right now, around at least those that are getting that first shot in the arm. So we'll see if we reach 75%. That's the magic number, and we'll go from there. We've run out of time, but I do want to thank you very, very, very much. This is such a fabulous way to understand what are really, big issues that we're facing. If there's anything that this this pandemic has brought us is the need for good, strong, ethical thinking as we debate and deliberate these tricky questions. So thank you very much, Dr. DiCarlo, for your time today. Just a reminder to everybody that this is part of a monthly series. So we will be back again. I think it's on June 16th is the next one. It's the second Wednesday of every month. So join us again next month where Dr. DiCarlo will tackle another interesting question around ethics during COVID-19. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.